Great. Thank you, Lauren. Welcome today. I'm Lindsay Marsh, and I have Ryan Gelman presenting with me as well. We have a small crew today, which is nice. We're going to be able to have really intimate Q&A. So please do send your questions to the chat, and we will answer them as we go. Just a brief agenda. We're going to talk about community action and our history with civic engagement, how community action came to be, the history behind our movement and how it pertains to today. We're going to talk about voter basics, how to register, how to make sure you can get to the polls, how to cast your ballot, those sorts of things. We're going to talk about staff engagement, how you can help your customers register to vote and participate in our democratic process. And then we have resources and some time for questions and answers. So without further ado, I will kick this over to Ryan.
Great, thanks, Lindsay. Hi, everyone. As Lindsay noted, I'm Ryan Gelman. I'm the Senior Associate for Public Policy and Advocacy at the Community Action Partnership. So I always like to frame this conversation just a little bit because I think that it's helpful. Basically, all of our sort of like quote unquote founding documents or ideas really relate back to this idea of community engagement and engaging civically in your community to improve the lives of community members. And that can be seen in the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, the original Economic Opportunity, like the Office of Economic Opportunity released instructions soon after that, and it can be seen there, as well as the CSBG Act. They all refer back to mobilizing resources in your communities to make positive changes. And sort of like marshaling resources at your disposal in order to make the lives of community members better. So I think that really relates directly to civic engagement and all the different things that we can be doing, especially in an election year, to help people exercise their right to vote and give their voices meaning. And that's really it. I just like to frame it that way because I think it's really sort of intrinsic to the values of community action to be engaged civically in your community. Anything you want to add, Lindsay, before we move on to?
Yeah, so we have the Black Lives Matter Huggy Heart here. And I think that one of the reasons that the community action has been pushing racial equity training and those sorts of things over the past couple of years, farther along than that, but it's really been baked into everything that we do for the past couple of years through the work that Tiffany Marley's been doing, is that we recognize that racism is an indicator of poverty. It is a cause of poverty. And those are the sorts of issues that we're talking about. We have a civic duty to be engaged in our communities, to root out the causes of poverty and eradicate them. And we can do that through the civic actions that we take as a community. So I'm about to go through some highlights of how your voice matters, but every voice, every vote does count in this country, and it can make a difference. When we're talking about voting, one of the things that we've talked about as a panel today, it's a dark time. We have a lot going on in our country. We have the Black Lives Matter movement. We have the COVID-19 pandemic. The political news of the day is a barrage. It never seems to stop. Love it or hate it, it's just constant. People want a way to feel proactive right now. I know a lot of my friends and family are sitting at home wondering what they can do to help make the country better. And one of the things that they can do is vote. They can make their voice heard. And if they don't like the way the country is going, they have a chance to say, I don't like this, I'm going to vote to change it, or vice versa. And I want to point out that everyone's voice counts. So this cartoon, I've seen it probably 100,000 times since the 2016 election. So many people feel that their vote doesn't matter, and that it's just me. No one matters. this microcosm, but it's not a microcosm. If everyone on the right-hand side says we didn't vote because it didn't make a difference, they vastly outnumber the people that did vote. I don't know, Ryan, if you remember, but I want to say there was something like 35% of the country voted in the 2016 presidential elections. So even if it's 40%, that means that 60% of the country didn't feel like their voice mattered, their vote didn't matter. And who knows, they might have all been Hillary supporters, they might have all been Trump supporters. We don't know, but their voice could have made a difference in the outcome of that election one way or another. Love it or hate it, recent elections have impacted you and your community. One of the things that has really struck me with the twin tracks that this year has gone on with major developments, BLM and COVID-19, where you are, those two things have been shepherded, guided largely through the local politicians and the local elected officials. So with COVID-19, we've seen governors taking control. The Trump administration said, we don't have a federal response. This is up to the states to do. The states were empowering you to take on the COVID-19 crisis and to work with it to the best of your ability. And we saw governors leading the COVID-19 response in their states. You might not have thought when you voted for governor that you were electing the person who was going to guide you through a pandemic, but that's what you did. Black Lives Matter. I live in Denver, and we have made, we've had protests, we've had demonstrations, we've had people at the state capitol building. A lot of that was made possible because Mayor Hancock let that happen. He didn't send the police in to shut it down. He let people use their voices and exercise their First Amendment rights. In some other places, that hasn't happened because the mayor was someone who didn't believe that that was legal or allowed or what have you. So the local politicians that are in your state, in your area, from the city council, the PTA, mayors, state representatives, state senators, have a lot to do with how your life goes on the ground, almost as much as your congressional representatives, your senators, and the president. I'm going to talk briefly about how else your vote matters. I've known of a couple of really close elections over the past 100 years, 200 years or so. But I wanted to highlight today the race in Virginia. It was a state house race in 2018 between Shelley Simmons and David Yancey. They tied. They literally tied. They recounted the votes multiple times. It was a tie. And the rules called for a coin toss to decide who was the winner of that race. Shelley Simmons lost the coin toss. David Yancey became the next state representative from that district. And you think it's just a seat, but in reality, that race was the difference in balance of power between the Republicans and the Democrats in the General Assembly in Virginia. So Shelley Simmons is a Democrat, David Yancey is a Republican. The Republicans had control of that entire body for the next cycle because of a coin toss, because somebody decided their vote didn't matter. And actually, if you research this, I'm a nerd, so I did. There are lots of examples of this happening throughout American history and actually global history. I think Zimbabwe was in there, maybe. There was some a few foreign examples that I found as well. The other reason that your voice matters, even if the candidate of your choice loses that election, there's a big difference between somebody winning 40-60 and somebody winning 49-51. So even if you think your candidate has no chance of winning, you still need to go out and make your voice counted, because if you can tie up or get an election really close, it means that the winner knows they don't have a mandate. Like George W. Bush took a mandate when he won his presidential election I think it was after 2000, even though he hadn't necessarily, it was a very close election. It came down to 600 votes in Florida. He pretended he had a mandate and he governed that way. But all along, he really didn't, because the election was very close, and it came down to 600 votes or some such. My point is that even if your candidate doesn't win, supporting that candidate supports their ideas. In the Democratic primary election, you see how Bernie Sanders and Governor Inslee impacted Biden throughout the course of that primary election because they garnered support, they garnered votes, and when they dropped out of the race, their ideas had shown traction in the Democratic Party, and so Biden adopted some of those ideas into his platform. I've seen the same happen on the Republican side in previous primaries. That's the point of those elections. So even if your candidate won't win or can't win, saying that you support them means something in the long run. Overall, on the local level, on the state level, on the federal level, if you want to see change, you can use your voice, and your voice is your vote. Next, we're going to go through some voter basics, staff engagement resources, and then we'll do Q&A. Again, we've got a small group, so that's a good opportunity to make sure we answer everyone's questions. It is impossible to run a national voter get out the vote registration mobilization plan without recognizing that every state has different laws. And so your state is different from probably 38 others in the nation. Fortunately, we've got some resources for you like vote.gov, rockthevote.org is another one. There are a few out there that can help you figure out how your state votes and what you need in your state to make sure that you can cast your ballot. Overall, across the country, you must be 17 at least and be turning 18 on or before November 3rd in order to vote this fall. That's important. If you have a 17-year-old in their house and their birthday is Halloween, get them to register now because they can cast a ballot in their first presidential election on November 3rd. You also must be a citizen of the United States and a resident of your state in order to register. You cannot register in multiple states and cast multiple ballots. You are only allowed to cast one federal ballot every year. But those are the basics. So we are not encouraging people who are undocumented to vote. That doesn't happen. It's not legal. We are encouraging everyone who is 18 or older on election day to take a look and register and cast their ballot. There are a few different ways to register. So the simplest for people who have internet access is to go to vote.gov. Rockthevote.org also is a good resource, but vote.gov is a federal website that walks you through all of the requirements of your state. So it's state specific, and it'll take you to the voter registration page for your state. Something to note is that voter registration deadlines are starting. Most of them are around October, sometime between the first week or two of October. If you want to request an absentee ballot, there are some other deadlines there. We will be publishing a toolkit in the next week that has graphics for each state with your voter registration deadline and your voter absentee ballot request deadline. So you can share those through your social media accounts, and we'll talk about the legalities of that in a couple of slides. So the easiest way to do this is to go through vote.gov. That's not always feasible, especially if people don't have internet access. When I registered on my 18th birthday, because I am a nerd, I went to the town hall. So I grew up in a small town of about 30,000 people, and our voter registration office was in town hall. I marched my little butt in there on my birthday and registered to vote in person. You can do that. And actually, vote.gov can help you, ironically, find where that location would be. Often there are also forms available for download. So if you're working with a customer and you want to help them register to vote, you might be able to print off that PDF for them and let them fill it out and submit it. So 3 different ways to do that. One of the reasons why we're doing this webinar today is because we keep hearing that people aged 18 to 22 to 25 are interested in voting and being civically engaged, but they don't understand the process. They think it's really complicated. They think there are lots of barriers, and they don't know how to go about it or what it actually entails. Ballots can certainly be overwhelming. I live in Colorado. We do vote by mail, but we also have a really intense ballot initiative piece of our ballots. I'm very grateful that I will get my ballot in a couple of weeks, and I'll be able to sit down and I'll take each ballot initiative one by one. I'll do my research. I can use the internet. I love going to the polls on election day, but sometimes I don't have a chance to do all of the down ballot races because one popped up that I wasn't expecting, or you have to memorize the names of the candidates in a long list of people that you want to vote for. Ballots can be overwhelming. You can go to 411.org and figure out what will be on your ballot. You can print that out. You can make your selections. You can take that with you to the polls if you're not voting by mail this year. So you have all of the information at your fingertips, and you can do your research before you walk into that voting booth. I remember having that feeling that of an unexpected race on a ballot and feeling like I was failing a test. So encouraging people to go to 411.org and vote 411.org to figure out what's going to be on your ballot can be very helpful. So you're not caught unaware when you go into your voting booth. When you get there, you enter your street address. It'll tell you if you need to bring an ID. There are some states, I want to say Mississippi or Alabama. I think it's Alabama. I'm sure that several states across the country require voter ID in order to, or some kind of ID in order to vote. There are voter ID laws across the country. Some of them are very controversial. Some of them are not, but being able to know that you need a driver's license or a passport or some kind of a photo ID is very helpful before you go to the polls. If you arrive at the polls and don't have a voter ID and you need one, you can still cast a provisional ballot, and we would encourage people to do that. So don't get turned away at the polls, but preparing in advance is the best way to do that. The last step is to make a voting plan. This year, because of COVID-19, the world is different. Some people will still go to the polls on election day. Some people will be requesting absentee ballots, which are also called mail-in ballots. Despite the confusion that's been in the news lately, they are one and the same. Absentee ballots, in some states, you require a reason to vote absentee. You need to be out of state, wintering in Arizona for the winter, but voting in Nebraska, or you need to be in a nursing home or have some other medical excuse. Other states, and more this year because of the pandemic, you don't have to designate a reason for your absentee ballot request. You do need to get those requests in soon. So that's something good to know. But if you plan to go to the polls on election day, how are you going to get there? Are you going to drive yourself? Do you need to coordinate a ride? Do you need to ask somebody for a ride? Both political parties often organize rides to the polls. So if you need to do that, you can reach out to the candidate of your choice and ask them to help you get to the polls. Do you need time off from work? Some places you do need to request that. Other places, Ryan, perhaps you know a little bit more about the labor laws and how everyone legally is entitled to time to go vote on election day, but you should know what your workplace is and how it works. If you're a waitress, make sure that your schedule doesn't start before 7 and end after the polls close at 7 or 8. Making those plans, make sure that you can cast your ballot on election day. Some places you can vote early. Minnesota and Virginia, for two examples, both opened early voting on Friday. They set up a polling place and they allow people to go in. A lot of people are choosing that option because it means that there might not be as many crowds and there might be less COVID-19 exposure. And of course, voting absentee ballot. Ryan, do you know anything or do you have anything to add to any of that?
Thanks, Lindsay. No, not really off the top of my head. I will say, you know, or if you live in a state where early voting is available, definitely take advantage of that, and encourage other folks to do the same where possible. It's just much easier. Oftentimes, what I've seen is they'll do it on a weekend, you know, to make sure that folks actually have the free time. Normally on like a Saturday or Sunday, and there's like sometimes limited hours, but it's a really great way to be able to cast your vote, especially like Lindsay mentioned, if you're in a situation where either your schedule won't allow it or you might not know what your schedule is going to be on election day and you aren't going to be voting by mail. Early voting is a really good option.
Sorry, totally hit all the wrong buttons and just screwed up the slide deck. I'm sorry about that, Ryan. Thank you. So action steps, please make sure that you are registered to vote. Make sure that your colleagues are registered to vote, your friends and your family members. Today is National Voter Registration Day. If you've managed to miss that, it's all over social media. It's all over my inbox. I feel like everybody, every corporation, every nonprofit that I've ever bought anything from or touched has emailed me to tell me that it is National Voter Registration Day. Please spread the word, encourage your friends and family to do it. If you've got kids who are 17 who will be 18 or kids who are 18, please remind them to do the same thing. Make your plan to vote. You can volunteer for voter registration. And we're about to get into CSPG and the legalities of all of this as it pertains to community action and your occupation. But you can volunteer with organizations like League of Women Voters who help people register to vote or rock the vote. You can also volunteer with a political campaign if you support a candidate and want to do that work. They are A, encouraging people to register, B, talking to voters and encouraging them to come out on election day. Both of those are valuable. Volunteer on election day. This is a tricky one for some people. If you are in a younger age bracket and do not have pre-existing conditions and are healthy, and you feel strongly about supporting our democracy, we encourage you to become a poll worker or a poll watcher. Poll workers are the folks who sit behind the table, who check you in, who help you use the machines. Poll watchers are usually partisan, but sometimes they're just legal entities who sit and watch to make sure that the election is fair. So they make sure that people don't get turned away when they have a valid voter ID card, or make sure that people know that they can cast that provisional ballot if they arrive at the polls and don't have their ID on them for some reason and an ID is required. So those folks watch to make sure that the election is conducted fairly. So we encourage you to do one of those two things if you are able-bodied and at less risk for COVID-19, because most of our poll watchers and poll workers in this country tend to be retirees. So 65 and older, the exact demographic we want to keep safe. And again, spread the word any way you can. We're going to talk through some ways that you can do that at work, but we also encourage you to do that in your personal life. So brings us to staff engagement. If any of you have been working with me on the census project, we've tried to make it very easy to slip the census into your everyday work. We're doing the same thing with voting. Ask your customers, hey, are you registered to vote? You can ask them to register, update, or confirm registration. This is important. A lot of people think that they are registered and they may have been purged from the voter rolls. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later, but it's very important to make sure that your registration is up to date, to have your correct address, your most recent address, and that you are still on the voter rolls. If you haven't been to an election in a few years, they may have cut you off the voter rolls, which means you need to re-register. We also encourage you to talk through how voting works in your community. Talk about those IDs. Point them to a place where they can find what's going to be on their ballot. Excuse me. Tell them when their polls are open. Many polls are open from 7 to 7. Some polls are open from 6 to 8, or some variants thereof. Some polls close at 6. Here in Colorado, we have to have our ballots in by 7 p.m. Because we do vote by mail. So we'll walk over to the ballot drop box and put ours in. Excuse me. Walking them through how your community votes is really important, in part to take away that fear of it's intimidating, I don't know what to do, but also to make sure that they have the appropriate information to make sure that their ballot gets in and gets counted. All of this is stuff that you can do through casual conversation, the same way you said, hey, did you get your census form? Can I help answer questions about the census? Except that this is this might be a little bit easier if you've already been a voter in your community. Okay, I'm going to let Ryan talk a little bit more about this. I will also mention, and Lauren can drop it in the chat, that we did an entire webinar on voter registration with CapLaw. So they walked us through all of this stuff and in detail. We're going to do a brief overview now, but we will point you towards that webinar.
Thanks, Lindsay. Yeah, this is just going to be sort of like very high level. We went into a lot more detail on the voter registration webinar that we did, as Lindsay mentioned, with CapLaw. But basically, for purposes of voter registration, there are generally 3 different sort of like sets of laws that govern political and quasi-political activity of nonprofits and CAAs, the tax code, the Hatch Act, and then for us, CSBG. For the purposes here today, we're not talking about political activity. We're not talking about electioneering. We're only talking about voter registration. And for that, the only real applicable set of laws is the CSBG Act, which was updated in 1998. So it does restrict and prohibit voter registration activities by CSBG funded entities, but basically the only thing that's restricted is that you can't do voter registration activities in a way that identifies those activities with any CSBG funded programs. In summary, basically, you can do voter registration activities as long as those activities are not funded by CSBG. So if you have a employee that's partially funded by CSBG, they can do voter registration activities in the hours when they're not being funded by CSBG. So essentially the overview is that if a person or like an hour or a particular type of work is not being directly funded by CSBG, then it can be used for voter registration activities. The same, just as like an aside, the same restrictions do apply to Head Start. Head Start funding, there's a little carve out, which is that nonpartisan organizations can use Head Start facilities for voter registration, like the League of Women Voters and other entities. So there is a little carve out there in Head Start, but the same restrictions apply. So as long as the funding isn't being directly used, then then anyone else can be doing voter registration activities.
One other thing that's worth mentioning is that CapLaw said that Facebook is a free platform. So one of the reasons why we've created state-by-state graphics for the voter deadlines is because Facebook's free. And so an employee can post in their non-CSBG funded time one of our voter registration graphics, which is perfectly legal and acceptable and is a way to encourage people to register to vote. And that 1 little minute of time that it takes to do that, that's not CSBG funded, you are perfectly within bounds legally, as long as it's nonpartisan, and all of our materials are, because we are a nonpartisan organization. And so that's one reason why we're doing heavy Facebook, Instagram, like social media postings, is because it's a free platform that makes it easy for our entities, our agencies to do that work.
I just want to. Yeah, I just want to note really quickly too, I know we talked about the voter registration webinar that we did, and this is going to be on a resource slide later, but certainly check out CapLaw's website because they have more in-depth information about this. Also, if folks are interested, the OCS information memo that relates to voter registration for CSBG funded entities is number 81. And that's available on our website, the partnership, and also on OCS website. I'm sure there's a link to it in the CapLaw materials, so that's another resource.
Great, thank you. Okay, so just to reiterate, community action is nonpartisan. We are pro-vote. We want everyone in our community, in our network, to cast a ballot who is a U.S. citizen and of legal age. But we are nonpartisan. We do need to do this work with non-CSBG funded programs. Uniform and equal education means that you can actually have a candidate forum If you have two people running, a Republican and a Democrat, for state legislature to represent your district, you can invite them both to a forum. You just have to do it equally. So you can't just invite the Republican, you can't just invite the Democrat, you can invite both of them. And again, our webinar goes into far more detail about all of that than I want to do today. But uniform and equal education means that you're welcome to educate your clients, customers, board members, volunteers, staff members on the candidates that are running, so long as you do it in a bipartisan manner, including all the candidates. Not to say that all of the candidates need to show up, but they do need to be given that platform. We're also promoting civic actions. We're promoting the fact that people should vote. We are not promoting one candidate over another in any way, ever. We've already talked about vote.gov. We've already talked a little bit about the COVID impact. We are really strongly encouraging people to do that early voting, as Ryan mentioned, vote by mail, request your absentee ballots. If you can request an absentee ballot now and you can drop it off in person, considering the current state of the U.S. Postal Service, that's not a bad plan. Just think it through and make sure that there's enough time for you to get your ballot and get it returned. I believe this graphic is pulled directly from one of the cap law resources that is on our resource page. So that is somewhere for you that you can take a look at later. Okay, so there are facts and myths about elections and voting. Want to talk through a couple of them. Who can and can't vote? This actually depends by state in some ways. I'm thinking about felons. In some states, felon voting rights have just been restored. It's been in the news in Florida and in Iowa that they're moving towards having people who have served their time have their voting rights restored. Which actually, I want to say it's a large number. It's like 3 million people maybe in Florida, which could sway an election. So those people who have served their time in federal penitentiary can now cast their ballots in federal elections in some places. It's important to know what your state does. And again, I can't go through all 50 states, but it should be on vote.gov. Undocumented immigrants, non-citizens cannot vote. By and large, there is absolutely no evidence that those populations do in large numbers or attempt to vote in large numbers. U.S. citizens can vote if they are age 18 as of election day or older, and they live in the state that they are registered in. Obviously, if you've got military families, that's the military has a whole process for absentee balloting, vote by mail. All of our military personnel vote through the mail. Who live abroad, expats also live in their original state. So I have a friend who lives in England with her husband, who's British. She's an American citizen. She votes in California. So she will get her mail ballot from California, and she'll return it to California. There's lots of stuff out there about how to vote that is misleading. One of the reasons why we talked through all of those steps today. The fact of the matter is that an absentee ballot is a mail-in ballot. People get confused about that. They are one and the same. Every person is entitled to one vote. So some of those things are out there. If you have any myths about that or any facts you want to check, please put those in the chat and we will address them. Voting fraud, there is a lot of misinformation about voting fraud. I actually went down a rabbit hole with this last night. There's very little evidence of voter fraud across the country. There are some pretty well-publicized examples. There was a former elected official in Pennsylvania that was recently, I think, put in jail, as rightfully so, for stuffing the ballot box. He took money, he took bribes to sit there with the voting machines before the polls opened and enter in votes for specific candidates. By and large, we catch those things. So as somebody who has been an avid poll watcher for decades, when you're looking at the returns and you know your race, when you know what your turnout is expected to be, you know which areas of town you're expecting high turnout for you and low turnout for you. If there's 100 extra ballots or 200 extra ballots, or if something seems off, you're going to pick up on that pretty quickly because you know your area. And that's one of the ways. There was a candidate in North Carolina's 9th district in 2018 that was taking absentee ballots and fraudulently filling them out. And that's one of the ways that they caught that whole scheme, was because the turnout was really weird in a couple of places. There were a lot of absentee ballots that were picked up in one post office box that seemed really weird. They noticed those patterns. So there have been multiple studies by nonpartisan entities that show no or little voter fraud in this country. And I'm pretty confident saying that it does not happen. It is a myth that's out there that I think is done to fearmonger, but voting is safe. Voting is monitored and fair and valid. Voter purges, however, are not a myth. Voter purges happen all over the country. If you haven't voted in a couple of cycles, the state cleans the voter rolls. People register when they move to a new state, but they never unregister, and that seems to be the way it goes. So if you are a voter, actually, I was registered to vote in Washington, D.C. 2 years ago. I bet I'm still registered there, even though I no longer cast my ballot there. I now vote in Colorado. I don't know how long I'll be on the voter rolls in Washington. I have no idea. At some point, they will clean the rolls, and they'll notice that I haven't cast a ballot in a couple of years, and they'll take me off the voter registration rolls. So voter purges happen all over the country. There have been a couple of pretty big examples. Some southern states, I want to say Mississippi or Alabama, maybe it's Georgia, maybe all three. Indiana, I know, did it. So we see some very aggressive secretaries of state clean that data a little bit too aggressively. And people who think that they're registered, maybe they voted in 2016, but they didn't go to the midterm elections, now might find that they're not registered for the presidential this fall because of an overzealous Secretary of State that purged anyone who didn't vote in the midterm elections. Maybe that's an extreme example, but we're not sure, and it's a state-by-state thing. So voter purges are real, which is one of the reasons why we're encouraging people to go to vote.gov and check their registration status, because if you think you're registered but you didn't vote in the last election, you might not be. Anything to add, Ryan?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I just want to note the importance of voter purges. Like, I think a lot of people, once they register, just assume that they're registered forever. But and it's not always like insidious. Like, secretaries of state often have to go through, like, see if people have moved. It's just a way to keep the lists updated. Obviously, in some places it's more insidious, but it's always good to just double check that you're registered. The last thing you want to do is show up at the polls on election day if your state doesn't have same-day registration and be told you can't vote because you weren't registered even though you thought that you were. So it's always good to just double check that you're registered at the correct address.
Although I will say, if that happens to you, you should cast a provisional ballot. The answer there is if you show up at the polls and they say for some reason that you cannot cast your ballot, request a provisional ballot. Cast your ballot no matter what. And if people have questions about that, we can go into that if you'd like, but let's move on. So part of that provisional ballot thing is knowing your rules, the rules and your rights. Something that a lot of people don't know is that, let's say your polls close at 7 p.m. You got in line in 6:50, but the line is around the block. What do? You have the right to stay in line to cast your ballot, even if it takes hours. And it has taken hours. There's stories every cycle of people who stood in line until 11 or 12, 1 o'clock in the morning to cast their ballot. They are allowed to do so if they were in line at 6:59 if the polls close at 7. So knowing your rights, knowing your right to a provisional ballot, knowing your right to know, some places there might be no voter ID rule, but the poll workers are misinformed and they think that there is a voter ID rule. So knowing that you do or don't have to have that voter ID is important before you walk into that voting booth or your early voting booth or to cast your ballot if you're absentee. Check your registration status. We've already mentioned that voter plan. Tying into the census, so this is near and dear to my heart. The 2020 census is still happening. It's still going on. We don't know when it's going to end. Right now, it looks like next Wednesday, the 30th, will be the last day to collect census responses. We might have another month. We really don't know. There's a huge political battle. I'm happy to talk about it if people are interested, but if you've been doing census work, it's really easy to now slip in the voter registration stuff in place of census or in addition to census. And the tie-in here is that we've just spent, I've just spent 18 months training our agencies on how to talk about the census and to convince people that they count. Another way that people count is through raising their voice and voting. So it's an easy tie-in. Anyone you've convinced to do the census, you should also be able to readily convince to register and cast a ballot as long as they meet the requirements of 18 and U.S. citizen and et cetera. Okay, we're coming to the end of our slides, but we do want to point out that on the 24th, I will be doing, with assistance, but mostly me, a webinar on census and redistricting. It's my thing, not Ryan's. Ryan does public policy and advocacy. He's way smarter about those things than I am, but the census is my deal. So you can join us on Thursday to talk about what happens now that the census is ending and what the next steps are for that census data and how it will impact your community and what you might be able to do to impact that to make sure that you have fair representation in your community. And then on October 22nd, Ryan will be leading us in a webinar about the right to vote. We're going to focus, I think, on election protection and rights and a history of how the vote was hard won by many groups in our country. To highlight the importance of making sure you make it to the polls in one way, shape, or form. Anything else to add on that, Ryan?
No, I don't think so.
All right, so now we've got some resources and we've got about 15 minutes. We don't need to stay the whole time, but if you have questions or want to talk about a specific topic that we didn't quite go in depth in, please pop things into the chat. So here we have a smattering of resources. We have handouts, flyers, posters, and fact sheets. These are about the census. These are also about civic action and engagement. So the one up on the top that says take action talks about the census and how you advocate and lobby and how you register to vote. The do's and don'ts that we've referenced a few times. That OCSIM, and then some resources for other places that are doing civic engagement work. That are nonpartisan that might help you do some research on your own about this work. And these are our contact emails and information. So I am Lindsay Marsh. Lauren is running behind the scenes. Ryan is co-hosting with me today. And Jim Masters and Alan Stansberry are subject matter experts for civic engagement. And they have been advising me. They've been working closely with me and my team on census. But they also do redistricting and voter registration and mobilization. They're the kind of experts in that trifecta. So any of us can answer questions, and you should feel free to reach out to any of us to learn more information. So with that, I will open it up for questions. Lauren, do we have anything in the chat?
Nope, I'm not seeing anything in the chat.
Okay, well, if people have questions, this is our contact information. We'll just make it a quick webinar today, but we do encourage folks to reach out to us. Some of this stuff can be pretty intimidating, but we have experts at hand and we have resources. CAPLA has been really wonderful helping us navigate the space between C3 and CSBG and help us tell you what you can do. And we do hope that you can help us make sure that 15 million voices, people that we serve every year, have a voice in the future of their communities. All right, with that, I think we will end it. Thanks for joining us today. We'll send out the PowerPoint and some notes and resources in the next 48 hours.
Thanks,
Have
everyone.
a good afternoon, everyone.